Hello, my name is Michael, and it's my very, very pleasant duty to welcome you to our conference. We're delighted to be back here in Liverpool, and as you know, the title of our conference is People, Partnerships and Potential. And the programme, which you'll have seen and no doubt studied with great care, focuses on the many strategic options of interest to senior managers, to clinical staff and to trustees, in short, to all of you, and on the shifts in service direction and workforce which hospices need to consider in order to stay relevant in the future care agenda. We have plenary speakers from within and beyond the UK, and their presentations are intended, and I hope will, both inspire and provoke. How can we reach the large number of people who could benefit from hospice care and who don't get it? How can we harness technology to support what we do? And which new partners in care do we have to think about and work more closely with? We're very grateful, as ever, to our sponsors and supporters, Lloyd's Pharmacy Healthcare Services, who sponsored this evening's drinks reception, Hayes McIntyre, who sponsored tomorrow's conference dinner, Linus Foster, who sponsor the hydration point, Macmillan Cancer Support, who've supported lunch and refreshment break, Marie Curie, who are sponsoring the Wi-Fi, PayPal, who are sponsoring the conference bags, and the National Garden Scheme for their generous support of hospice care, and in particular for their support for the Innovation Awards, which will be presented later today, immediately after the second plenary this afternoon. We would encourage you to visit and talk to our exhibitors and to enter the prize draw, details of which are in the postcard, on the postcard in your packs. I'm also asked to remind you to turn your phones to silent, and indeed, in the event of an emergency, the arrangements will be as follows. An announcement will be made asking delegates, exhibitors and organisers to leave the building by the nearest available exit. The muster point is on the piazza outside the Jury's Inn. Delegates with access requirements will be guided to the nearest refuge point by a venue steward, where they will receive further assistance. No one is to return to the building until official announcements have been made by ACC Liverpool. I now turn to our first speaker, and we are very, very fortunate indeed to have with us this morning Professor David Clarke. David is the leader of the End-of-Life Studies group at Glasgow University and the holder of a Wellcome Trust Investigator Award to support a project entitled Global Interventions at the End of Life. He's an expert on the history of palliative care and in particular on the life of Dame Cicely Saunders. And indeed, he's at work on a biography of Dame Cicely, which I believe will be published in 2018. He's going to focus this morning on what the past can teach us as we enter challenging new times for hospice and palliative care. His subject is the 7 ages of hospice care, and he is the author of this new book, To Comfort Always. It's just been published. It's on sale at a discounted price at the conference, and David will be available to sign copies in the main auditorium immediately after the plenary. And there's a pile of the books behind me. You're very welcome to come up and buy one. So it's with very great pleasure that I call upon Professor David Clarke to be our first speaker at our plenary session at the conference. David.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that warm welcome, and to the organisation for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I just wish I could see you, but I know you're out there. I gave myself this title fairly recently, thinking about my talk. And what I'm wanting to do is to essentially base it on this new book, which has just come out, but to broaden it out a little bit from the book to take in some wider issues. The book is actually a history of palliative medicine. It's in a series called Oxford Medical Histories, and it focuses in particular on the medical contribution to this field over a long period of time. But of course, it's very hard to do that without touching on many other aspects of palliative care as well. And what I tried to do in the talk, but which I don't actually do in the book, is to characterize 7 ages of change and development in the history of this work. So this is a nod really to the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare. And of course, in As You Like It, there's the famous speech about the 7 ages of man, and I've taken that as my cue today. A few kind of methodological points about these 7 ages. In a sense, they are chronological time periods, though I haven't identified them formally in the talk. But they're not exclusively so. The ages are not of equal duration in time. They sometimes overlap with each other and blur into each other. And I was more and more struck as I went along thinking about this, that some of the elements of the 7 ages persist over longer periods and then disappear and sometimes recur. So what my goal is today is to really try to sketch out the longue durée of hospice and palliative care, which really for me, as you'll see, is something like a 200-year history. I know that next year we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of St. Christopher's, but there is a longer history to be explored, and that's what I try to do in the talk, and it's also the period of time that I cover in my book. So the goal of all this really in this context of the conference and its wider themes is really as an antidote to simply focusing on the moment and the here and now, and to take a little pause to look at the longer history of this field in which we're engaged. And here are the 7 ages: awakening, charism, indifference, uncertainty, formation, recognition, and challenge. And I've given each of these a definition which will come up as we go along, and it's in tweet length. So it's inside 140 characters. You'll see it come up. And I've actually given 1 or 2 tweeters access to these 7 tweets in advance of now, and they may start to appear on Twitter as we go along. So these are my 7 ages as I see them, and I want to, I think, rather briskly go through them all, but reminding ourselves that these aren't ages which begin and end, and one of which follows on from the previous one. There's this interesting swirling around and overlapping between them. So we start with awakening, and here I define this as medical men describe procedures for managing the terminally ill. Fear of the dying process increases, and the meaning of euthanasia changes. So that's the tweet, and maybe it'll start to appear. So what's going on here in this period of awakening? When I started writing this book, my intention was to give it 2 simple bookends. The first was the year 1887, when William Monk published his book on euthanasia. And the second bookend was 1987, when the specialty of palliative medicine was recognized in Britain, the first country to do so. But as I began to read into the work of Monk and other doctors writing in the 19th century, I discovered that what Monk was writing about, using the term euthanasia, which I'll explain in a moment, was being done before Monk. I was unaware of this, and it indeed went back some decades before the publication of his book. And so what we have here, which I'll try and focus on in this part of the talk, are 3 key texts, all with the title Euthanasia, produced in the period 1826 to 1887. And the first of them was an MD thesis written by C.F.H. Marks, no relation, at the University of Göttingen. It was written in Latin and eventually translated into English in 1952. And I think what you'll see in each of these works is some strikingly modern aspects in terms of the thinking and the approach to care of people at the end of life. So here's a picture of Marx. He defines euthanasia as a science which checks oppressing features of illness, relieves pain, and renders the supreme and inescapable hour a most peaceful one. But it's a science that the practice of euthanasia is to bring this about. And through the 19th century, we see this consistent meaning of euthanasia to refer to the production, the medical role within the production of an easeful death. So it's not the term euthanasia in its modern context, which doesn't really begin to engage until the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th. So doctors throughout the 19th century using the term euthanasia to talk about their role in the production of an easeful death, but always cautioning against the idea that this should involve the deliberate intervention by the physician to end the life of the patient. And this comes through in all of these works and indeed in more general textbooks of the period. So here a beautiful quote from Marx where he talks about the orientation of the physician to euthanasia, this shining ray of, where no shining ray of hope remains, the kind of positive intervention that can be brought about to bring an easeful death, to ease the suffering of the patient, and also, interestingly, in the last part of that quote, to ease that passing in a way that will not be dreadful to those left behind. And when you break down Marx's writing on euthanasia, it has these three elements, which, again, I find strikingly modern in orientation. The notion of foresight, watchful attendance, and advanced thinking, what we might today call advanced planning about the comfort of the patient. The avoidance of suffering, something which has crept into the WHO definition of palliative care much more recently, but here laid out in 1826 by Marx. What interventions can the physician make to avoid as well as to relieve suffering once it's established? And highlighting the importance of the physician in engaging with the higher comfort of the patient. This isn't something that should simply be left to the priest. The physician also has a role in assuaging fear, in giving confidence, giving assurance and support. And through all of this, Marx, as those who followed him, making it clear that euthanasia is not about the physician bringing forward the moment of death. This is a practice he condemns. So this, for me, is a landmark first contribution to the debate about what has now become known as palliative care. In 1826, albeit in Latin, written as a university thesis, though it was read widely by doctors in what we now call Germany. Not long after that, the first ever gathering of physicians to establish a national medical association takes place in Philadelphia. And in drawing up what we believe is the first code of medical ethics that exists in the modern context, those doctors were not blind to this question of care at the end of life, urging the physician not to abandon patients because the case is deemed incurable. So beginning to build in and highlight the importance of the care of the dying patient as a central aspect of the practice of medicine. And then there's another thesis, 1854 in Edinburgh. Hugh Noble, we know nothing about him other than this thesis, which was uncovered by a doctoral student at Edinburgh University a few years ago. She and myself have failed to trace him anywhere afterwards, so if you know anything about Hugh Noble, I'd be pleased to talk to you. But he again writes a thesis entitled Euthanasia, and begins to lay out the medical principles which should underpin this kind of orientation to the seriously ill and dying patient. And the little bit that I've highlighted here in the quote, I think is terribly important, that when the hope of recovery is past, more may be done. This is the time for restudying the case from a different viewpoint with a new objective. Now, when I read that the first time, I immediately was reminded of some of the writings of Cicely Saunders, railing against the term, "there's nothing more that can be done," and arguing forcibly that there are many things that can be done in the face of death for the dying patient if we have the will, the imagination, and the skill. And this is, I think, being prefigured here in the writings of Noble. He pauses in the middle of his thesis to raise the question about intervention to deliberately end a life. We're now reaching a time when opium has been synthesized in the laboratory, when morphine is becoming freely available, when it can be injected using a hypodermic syringe, when there's growing interest in pain as a clinical problem and the relief of pain with strong medication. And one senses here in Hugh Noble's writing, if we can relieve pain in these ways, might we also prevent suffering by intervening to end life prematurely? He hesitates on that point in the middle of the thesis, and then moves on and concludes that this isn't the role of the doctor. And then the final work of this period, by William Monk, what I thought was the beginning of this kind of medical writing, but turns out to be at least the third major contribution to it during the course of the 19th century. Monk had a long career. These predecessors writing their MD theses were young doctors at the beginning of their medical career. Monk practiced medicine for 60 years in London. He's best known not for this book, Euthanasia, but for Monk's role and his role as a medical biographer with the College of Physicians. And he writes this book towards the end of his career for reasons that we're not clear about. It suddenly appears, having not been a topic on which he'd written previously. And I think my inclination is, and I do say this in the book, is to regard William Monk as, in a sense, the grandfather of modern palliative medicine. And 100 years after the publication of his book, indeed, the specialty was recognized as such. But like Marx and like Noble, what he's doing in this book is to, and it's a book that's easily obtained, even now you can buy second-hand copies quite easily, is to lay out the principles and the practice of what we would today call palliative medicine and palliative care. I think he's quite attentive to the medical aspects of this, deals in detail with physical symptoms, the relief of pain, the use of opium, worth all the materia medica, to be used judiciously. But he touches on a lot of nursing aspects. It's clear that he's read Florence Nightingale. He writes quite a bit about the arrangements of the bedchamber. He writes a lot about food and fluids and the use of alcohol as a stimulant. Things that I read in Cicely Saunders' first paper, published in 1958, here laid out in great detail by Monk in 1887. Unlike the other two works entitled Euthanasia, this work was published as a book and achieved a wider audience. It was extremely well reviewed in The Lancet and was clearly on the reading list of many people in the few decades that followed it. And we know it was read and referenced, for example, in the United States. So the same title, the same kinds of themes as Marx and Noble, but beginning to reach a wider audience. It was picked up by William Osler, who refers to it, I think rather grudgingly. I think he perhaps feels that Monk had stolen his thunder on this, because a few years later, of course, Osler's lecture on immortality, in which he describes his observations of 500 dying patients was published and gained a great deal of attention. But Osler really sits alongside these writers on euthanasia in that he was concerned about the medical disposition towards the dying patient. And coming towards the end of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th, he was vacillating rather more than Noble had done about whether the role of the doctor should also include the deliberate ending of life of the patient. But throughout the 19th century, when we see the term euthanasia used, it's being used in this broader, this classical Greek sort of sense of euthanatos, the production of the good death and the role of the doctor within that. So this is, for me, the age of awakening, the laying out in medical texts, but we also see it in nursing texts as well, of these kinds of principles to do with the care of the dying. The next age I call charism, and here we have center stage not men but women, usually nursing women who deliver religiously motivated institutional hospice care to small numbers of people, but where the wider influence of this work is rather weak and growth is limited. So this may be somewhat familiar to you. The 19th century was the great age of institutions. It was an age of hospital building, and it's the period in which we see, for the first time, I would argue, institutions established uniquely for the care of people who are dying. We'll be told, and you will be told, that there are hospices in the historical record that go back to medieval times or even further. But I think what we see in the 19th century, when the whole epidemiological transition gets underway, where the causes of death start to shift from sudden death to chronic illness and more protracted processes of dying, that a space opens up in which you can have an institutional response to the needs of dying people, because dying has become a process and not an event. And then we see, from the middle of the 19th century onwards, institutions around the world being established for this purpose, often established by women and certainly staffed and organized on a day-to-day basis for them. They are, in my estimation, the foundation stones for the modern hospice movement. And on this slide, we have a kind of resume of these different hospices in many different parts of the world. And the latest one that I've been able to add to that list, which I was very, very interested to see and which I want to find out more about, is as early as 1876, the hospice in Pondicherry in India. Pops up on the record recently, something that we didn't know about, but clearly with French connections. So a lot of these institutions developing in different parts of the world, and I'll just briefly illustrate some of them from different countries. You probably are aware of the role of Jeanne Garnier in Lyon, probably the first hospice foundress in the European context. I started my hospice with 50 francs and Providence did the rest. That led not just to places in Lyon, as we can see from this chart, but also to homes in the name of Garnier that were established in Paris, Saint-Étienne, in Bordeaux, Brussels, and other places, Rouen, during the following decades of the 19th century. So quite a spread of development there, inspired by the work of the young widow, Jeanne Garnier. Frances Davidson I try and give a salute to, because if you ask most people who she is, or if they've heard of her, and if I did a straw poll in here, I may get the same result. Most people don't know who she is. She was born in Aberdeenshire. For some reason that we're not clear about, she found her way to London, where she worked with the Mildmay Mission in the East End of London. And in 1885, in a small set of premises, she set up something she called the Friedenheim, a home of peace for people dying with tuberculosis. And it went through various iterations, moved to Hampstead at one point, was absorbed into the National Health Service in 1948, but eventually closed in 1981. if you look at the very first publication of Cicely Saunders, where she describes the preacher of atheism that she looked after as a social worker, he died in the Friedenheim, by now known as St. Columba's, in Hampstead in the 1950s. So this is really the first English hospice, though it no longer exists and is sometimes forgotten, but it was established by a Scot, and I enjoy saying this when I'm in Scotland particularly. You will know of others that followed soon afterwards, the Hostel of God in Clapham, established by an appeal in the Times, now Trinity Hospice from 1980. So this is one of the hospices that has made that transition from this period of charism into the later period in the modern era. And similar things happening in the United States to France. You have an inspirational figure in Rose Hawthorne who experiences loss in her own family, wants to do something about the care of people with advanced cancer, and sets up a home to that effect in New York in the middle of the 1890s that leads to others in other parts of New England and further afield. So you're beginning to see this pattern that's emerging among these homes developing in various different contexts. St. Luke's Home for the Dying Poor, which was its original name, again went through various iterations, was absorbed into the NHS, eventually closed in the 1970s, but was a place where, as you will know, Cicely Saunders was a volunteer nurse whilst working as an almoner during the day in the 1950s. For 7 years, she was also doing nursing work there in the evenings and in the weekends, and that was where she was learning about the regular giving of analgesia to prevent the onset of pain as well as to relieve it once it was established. And then finally, St. Joseph's Hospice, established by the Sisters of Charity, another example, following on from Our Ladies in Dublin, established 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier. Here in Hackney in 1905, admits its first 2 patients, both with tuberculosis, one cold night on the 14th of January, and again develops over time, as they'll tell you at St. Joseph's, constantly building and rebuilding the hospice on what is rather a large footprint of land, and continuing through into the modern era and becoming, of course, the place that was so important to Cicely Saunders when she really sets out on this path of learning more about hospice. So in this area of charism, these are some of the dominant features. Most of the homes have a denominational character. They're Anglican, they're Catholic, they're Methodist. They have strong religious orientations. If you read accounts written within the homes in their annual reports and so on, you'll see a lot of emphasis on soul cures, happy and holy deaths, sometimes deathbed conversions, or people whose faith, having been lost, is rekindled on the deathbed. There is no formal medical writing about any of this work over many decades until 1949, when we see a publication by Dr. Sprott, who practiced for many years at the Friedenheim and later St. Columba's, and who, on retirement, wrote a very, very interesting article in 1949 in the medical press, where, again, he lays out many of the principles of palliation and palliative care in the same kind of genre and style as those 19th century writers. But a huge kind of void in terms of writing about these places that we can find in the published literature. And as I've said, only a couple of them making the transition into the modern era. So if you want to understand them, and there are a couple of very good theses, PhD theses, that have been written about the Friedenheim and about the London hospices, you have to go into the primary record. You don't find doctors in those hospices writing about their practice or sharing their experience until that publication in 1949. And I think this marks the beginning of the third age, the age of indifference, when dying is becoming more taboo in the modern context. Medicine is retreating from the deathbed. Knowledge is being lost about good care of the dying. Social conditions are changing, and the awareness that suffering is increasing at the end of life begins to be more widely recognized. So then this era, the era of indifference, and the next one, which is the age of uncertainty, are kind of two sides of the same coin. And you see this emerging in the period after World War I in particular, some of these themes. So the homes, although they got off to an interesting start, the terminal care homes, the hospices, under their different names, failed to make traction. They don't go to scale, as we would say in the modern context. They continue to do very interesting work for small numbers of people in a very localized context and in the framework of religious organizations of various types. Meanwhile, we know that dying people are being ignored or even excluded from hospitals over a longer period. The acute hospital has become less and less welcoming to the dying patient. And medicine is going into higher gear and moving into a period of hubris. By the end of this period, into the 1950s, there's a lot of medical writing in the United States about the potential to cure all cancers, even advanced disease at the metastatic level. There's a belief that somehow this can be reversed, and a great sense of optimism within medicine about the potential for rehabilitation and cure. Less and less attention, and particularly in medical writing, to issues about people with long-term conditions who are facing death and have advanced disease. And this also couples with a wider cultural denial of death that sets into European culture, particularly after World War I. You probably know that that was a period when, following the death on an industrial scale, there was a great interest in spiritualism and memorializing the dead. But the dying process itself became hidden away. This was the term that, as sociologists, we tend to use. This was the beginning of the sequestration of death, when death starts to very noticeably be removed from public space and to become hidden away. And so this is another characteristic of this age of indifference, terminal neglect and sequestration of death. And Alfred Worcester is an American physician, sometimes regarded as one of the founders of modern geriatric old age medicine. Again, towards the end of his life, and as you can see, it was a very long life, he wrote a fascinating little book called The Care of the Aged, the Dying and the Dead. In some ways, it's a kind of combined geriatric and palliative care book. But in that, he notes that the skills that nurses and doctors and others formerly possessed in relation to the care of people at the end of life are being lost. There's less interest, there's less research, there's less teaching. There's a professional disinterest and neglect. And therefore, less and less is known about the whole field, as we would now call it, of care of those with advanced disease and at the end of life. And he makes quite a strong point here in 1935 that I think shores up my notion that this was, in a way, the age of indifference to these issues. And here's another little illustration from closer to home. Over the years, I've done a lot of interviews with people who practice palliative care in many parts of the world. And this is a man called John Barclay, who is talking here about his experience as a GP in the Scottish Highlands in the 1950s. A feeling of utter helplessness about how to deal with a young patient with advanced cervical carcinoma dying at home. A feeling that they were using drugs in a way that wasn't properly thought through, where they weren't confident in their approach, but there was nowhere to turn to for guidance, for information, for education. So this kind of indifference within the medical literature to these issues, I mean, strongly kind of echoed there in the dilemmas of, at that time, a young doctor working in isolation and struggling to feel able to do the best for his patient. And this really then tracks us into the age of uncertainty, when people start to look for knowledge. They start to look for more information, for more guidance. There's a concern starting to emerge in some quarters that the care of the dying has somehow become devalued, marginalized, pushed out of the discourse of modern medicine and healthcare. And this also coincides with the growing number of calls for the legalization of euthanasia and the creation of societies and organizations that are concerned with the promotion and legalization of euthanasia. By this time, the meaning of euthanasia has changed, and it is no longer the euthanatos notion, and it is much more clearly the role of medicine in particular in intervening to end the life of a person who is suffering intolerably and wishes that life to be ended. So I think this is a feature of this age of uncertainty. And again, it's a bit hard to pin down an actual period of time here, but I'm certainly thinking about the years after World War II and through the 1950s. In that uncertainty, some people are groping towards looking for information, and many of you will know this landmark study that was done by the Marie Curie Memorial and the Queen's Institute of District Nursing and published in 1952. It was probably the first modern needs assessment in the sense that we would understand it today. Data collected on 7,000 people with cancer living all across the United Kingdom. A lot of information. The message of this was that many of these people were suffering in isolation. They often lived in poor housing. They didn't have heating. They didn't have water in the house. They had no bathrooms, toilets. They were neglected. They were isolated. There was a sense of fatalism amongst them and those caring for them, that nothing could be done about their condition, and that advanced cancer was a horrible thing to endure. It would lead to death, and really nothing much could be done. You simply had to, as they say in Scotland, thole it. This was the kind of theme that came through strongly of all the interviews and data that were collected by the district nurses in this important study. And there was another study done not long afterwards which looked at the similar sort of situation of people in elderly people in institutional care. It was published later in the 50s and indeed echoed Shakespeare. It had the title Sans Everything, and which was a devastating critique of Britain's approach to the institutional care of older people. So you're beginning to see this kind of groping towards understanding the problem better, albeit in a rather uncertain way. So at the beginning of the 1950s, you have the Marie Curie report, and then towards the end of the 1950s, published in the early 60s, you have this report, Peace at the Last. It was produced, again for reasons I'm not quite sure of, by Brigadier Glyn Hughes. He was a medical doctor. In fact, he was the first Allied doctor to enter the Belsen concentration camp at the end of World War II. So you see him there in his military attire. But again, he did a big survey trying to look at needs and demand and institutional provision for care of older people and those at the end of life. He estimated in the mid-50s that 270,000 people were in need of skilled terminal care but were dying outside of NHS hospitals. And he rather despairingly concluded that for a long time to come, there will remain a need to make use of accommodation outside the NHS, both in voluntary and in profit-making establishments. And by those, of course, he was referring in the main to private nursing homes. Both of these reports were extremely important to Cicely Saunders in the formation of her own ideas and had a degree of influence at the time. At the same time, and prior to World War II, in the UK context, the Voluntary Euthanasia Legislation Society was founded. We know that doctors played a very active role in this, and founded in 1936. It's quite interesting. In 1935, within a year, they had a bill in front of the House of Lords, which by modern standards seems remarkably rapid progress. The bill was unsuccessful. It was tried again in 1950. It was talked out by a number of medical peers. The Lancet commented on it. arguing that the good doctor will distinguish between prolongation of life and the unnecessary prolongation of the act of dying. Again, opening up a space for debate and discussion about what is the proper orientation of medicine, but one might also argue of society as a whole, to these dilemmas, as dying becomes an extended process with multifaceted problems and issues associated with it in the context of chronic illness and aging. Again, Millard, one of the founders of the Euthanasia Legalization Society, pointing out that they had a lot of members who were distinguished physicians, including 30 who'd been knighted. So there's this ongoing issue about the relationship between medicine and the legalization of euthanasia, certainly in this country. But there are also wider debates happening in this period of time through the late 30s and 40s and 50s. This classic book edited by Herman Feifel, the American psychologist, comes out in 1959, The Meaning of Death. It has a series of riveting essays in it by a number of well-known philosophers, historians, and clinicians, exploring the modern disposition to dying, often in a critical way, in relation to the care that's available. And we also see other things happening in a more popular way. Jessica Mitford's book on the American Way of Death, the Glaser and Strauss studies in California in the 60s on the management of the process of dying in hospitals. Illich talking about the medicalization of death, Jeffrey Gorer, the pornography of death. So an emerging kind of cultural critique around our disposition to the care of the dying, coinciding with some doctors starting and other healthcare workers starting to say we need more information, we need to think through more our orientation to this and try to move forward. And the Lancet here with a rallying call in 1960, we must attack the problem from every side. So trying to make an alliance of individuals and organizations to address these questions. And this really takes us then into what I call the age of formation. Total pain transforms care of the dying into a multidisciplinary endeavor using teamwork, a knowledge base, and teachable skills. I imagine this period is more familiar to you. In simple terms, it begins in 1958 when Cicely Saunders gets a fellowship at St. Mary's, goes to St. Joseph's, and starts to learn the craft of looking after people. Now as a doctor, having looked after them as a nurse and as a social worker, now as a newly qualified doctor at St. Joseph's in the East End of London. Doing studies, never completing her MD, but building up a huge amount of data on the experience of her patients in terms of clinical data, but also in terms of interviews. By 1961, she'd got a tape recorder and she was recording interviews and using these interviews in her writing and in her teaching to express the voice of the hospice patient. By the end of her time at St. Joseph's, she had amassed data on 1,100 patients. So it was a considerably significant achievement to do that in that context. And it's here that I've just written a very, very long chapter about this period, 1958, when Cicely goes to St. Joseph's, to 1967, when St. Christopher's Hospice opens. It's a period in which so much happens to her, but also such a consequential period for hospice and palliative care. And here is one of the patients that so much influenced a part of that, Mrs. Hinson, who famously talked to Cicely about the various problems that she was having, her concerns about herself, about her family members, the pain that she'd experienced, the worries that she had about her faith and about whether or not God had somehow made a judgment on her that had led to the situation she was in. And used that famous phrase to Cicely Saunders, all of me is wrong. And this was used to crystallize out the concept of total pain as something which is multifaceted, which is not only physical, but has psychological, social, material, and of course spiritual and religious dimensions to it. And I believe that concept was the central notion that drove forward the field that we've now come to understand as hospice and palliative care, this concept of total pain, which resonates throughout Cicely Saunders' writings and becomes absolutely central to the practice of this new field of care. And she quickly found others in this period of formation of like mind. So I don't know if people know who those are, but in the middle of the photograph is Florence Wald, who was the Dean of Nursing at Yale when Cicely first visited the United States in 1963, gave a lecture to the School of Nursing. It was so well received that they asked her to repeat it immediately the next day so they could bring in more people. Florence Wald heard it, was deeply moved by what Cicely was saying. They became lifelong friends and collaborators, and Wald and her husband and associates went on to found the first hospice in New Haven in the United States in the modern context. And of course, on the right, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross doing other things to shore up these endeavors at that time. Her own work in the Billings Hospital in Chicago, writing books that gained not just a large professional audience, but were widely read by the general public. In that slide, you could also put lots of other people who are bubbling up at this time, Colin Murray Parkes and John Hinton and Exton Smith, a variety of people starting to do studies, working together, sharing information and knowledge with each other. If you read the correspondence, always mailing each other reprints and sometimes reprints of reprints made on inky machines to share information long before the internet and the ability to attach things to emails. A great kind of sense of formation going on in the early to mid-60s in what is now becoming an international network of people concerned with similar interests. And St. Christopher's, the next landmark, that's the digging of the first turf in 1964 with Cicely and Lord Thurlow, who's the chairman of the St. Christopher's board at that time. And the building then going up, this striking modern building using these modern cantilever methods, designed by Peter Smith, the architect that had designed the modern wing, the Our Lady's wing at St. Joseph's, in which Cicely had practiced and first learned the art of palliative medicine, going to Smith for St. Christopher's and getting this striking modern statement about how you could build on the old virtues of charism and religious orientation, but practice a modern form of care in a purpose-built building like this one. And as you know, St. Christopher's opening in 67 in July, but receiving visitors long before it had patients. It was already becoming a beacon to attract people with like minds and interests from many parts of the world, even before it was an operating service. So this led on then to the era of recognition when hospice and palliative care becomes a field of recognized specialization with associated research and education, but where also other issues begin to pop up, definitional and boundary questions and debates begin, and some of those are very much still with us in this today. So the era of recognition, I think partly we must attribute to Balfour Mount. There's a long quote here, but the essence of it was that he'd been to St. Christopher's in the mid-70s, 73, very impressed by what he saw, but he couldn't see it working in the hospital context in Canada. He was looking for a way to transplant the hospice ideal of the freestanding charitable institution outside the NHS, which Cicely had deliberately established, into the public health system of the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. And part of his problem was language. He thought that the term hospice would not play well in that context and had some negative associations in French that would not be helpful. And famously, while shaving one day, he came up with the notion that if we have palliation, an established concept in medicine, and you will see that word used freely in the writings of those 19th century physicians that I talked about, why couldn't we have palliative care as something wider that would capture this whole notion? And then he dug into the origins and the etymology of the term, of the word, and found its associations with the cloak, with pallium, palliare, and so on. So this is the beginning of this new term, and it's part of the process of wider recognition. A process which is supported by a number of other factors, forging new approaches to clinical practices in this era that we see the decline and demise of the Brompton cocktail. It's kind of deconstructed by Robert Twycross in a very interesting way to demonstrate that really morphine and by injection or by mouth can be just as effective when used properly as this rather complicated, though exotic, mixture of whatever you fancy, gin, brandy, morphine, cocaine, largactil, tincture of cannabis. It varied from one place to another, but although Sicily embraced it at first as something very important, it became clear that it wasn't the most appropriate or effective way to adopt a modern approach to pain management. So a lot of good studies going on around that, and other studies happening in the hospices, work of Hinton I mentioned, but also, of course, Murray Parks, the evaluations at St. Christopher's. And during this era, we're starting to see the influence of these activists, not only on the clinical practice of patients and those looking after them in these places, called hospices mainly, but on policy, on service development, and this taking on a national and international character. And quite key to that was the role of hospices in providing education and training. And this is a great photograph that appears in a publication from the Wellcome Trust based on a witness seminar that was held at the Wellcome a few years ago. It's in the farewell to Tom West, medical director at that time in 1992 in St. Christopher's. And you see Mary Baines in the tartan in the front of the photograph. The picture was taken in her home. You could spend some time working out who all those people are. They're listed at the side. But clearly this was a whole cadre of people who were in and around St. Christopher's at that time, who were going to go on to really make a very significant impact upon the growth and development and maturation of the field of palliative care through training programs at St. Christopher's and other places like that. So this is the path to specialty recognition. I believe the hospice movement is part of the platform for it. In the 1980s, 10 new hospices were appearing every year. 100 hospices that in a decade were established. We also saw the reinvigoration of Macmillan and Marie Curie towards these issues, and they did a lot to support the early specialist posts in the field. And a whole new cadre following on from Sicily of new hospice medical directors, both in the independent sector but also within the NHS. Derek Doyle, Twycross, Richard Hillier. The role of Gillian Ford, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, who did so much to contribute to the backroom work that led to the specialty of palliative medicine being recognised. The creation of the journal, the training fellowships, the teaching programs, all starting to happen at a pace. So that in 1987, we see for the first time in any country in the world the formal recognition of palliative medicine as a specialty, a field of higher medical training. It was taken in as a novitiate to begin with, but then established as a full specialism in due course. The next country to do it was Ireland. So this was a major landmark in 87, and I'd intended really to stop my book there, but I couldn't resist going on after that, just as I found I had to go back a little bit earlier, pre-1887, but this is a very, very key moment in the history of the field. This is another key landmark that followed soon afterwards, the Oxford textbook of palliative medicine. 103 contributors, 845 pages, 18 sections, 72 chapters, many people from around the world contributing, and of course many subsequent editions of that and other textbooks consolidating the field, underscoring and shoring up this notion of recognition and specialization. It's a bit difficult to know just how many countries in the world have gone down this path of either specialty or subspecialty recognition. This is my best estimate at the moment. So 24, 25 countries. Interestingly, the US came rather late to recognition, but it called the specialty of hospice and palliative medicine, unlike many other countries which chose the name palliative medicine. We also know that the countries in which this recognition exists map onto those countries which in the world map that we've produced over the years of palliative care development are in the highest category of development. So there is a link between recognizing the medical specialty and other developments taking place in a country. But as I said, this was also a time when definitional and conceptual issues start to arise, a lot of debates about the difference between hospice and palliative care. The definition of palliative care comes under scrutiny. We have a lot of internal discussion about the nature of the specialty. Somebody once remarked, no disease, no stage of life, no organ of the body. What kind of a specialty is that? We now have notions of early intervention, palliative care. We have a debate between generalist and specialist. And more recently, we've had a turn to public health. We must adopt a public health orientation as a possible way out of some of these sorts of dilemmas. A lot of rich and interesting debates going on in that area. And this brings me finally to the era of challenge. Global need is rising. Policies, services, and new models are seeking to bridge the gap between those who are able to access the palliative care that can help them and those who don't. This often involves the use of public health approaches. It looks to an evidence base to drive it, and the services, once established, are oriented to quality improvement approaches in various ways. But the challenge now is massive. I put up this slide. Why do I do that? This is an estimate that was done a few years ago of all the people who died in the 20th century. It's a fascinating slide. You can find it on the internet. It was produced by the Wellcome Trust. The reason I put it up, though, is because it is not about the 20th century, but the number of people that died in the entire 20th century, 5.5 billion roughly, is smaller than the number of people currently living in the world. This is the scale of the challenge. The world's population is growing very rapidly, and that is a result of population aging. It's not a result of an increase in the birth rate. We are living longer, and that is driving up the population. Some people think it could go to 10 billion. And with that come consequences for our field. We currently have sort of 55, 56 million deaths in the world in a year. And bear in mind that 85% of those take place not in the rich world, not in the global north, but in developing low and middle income countries. But we think that the numbers of people dying in the world each year could go up to 90 million plus in the next few decades. And most of that growth will be in the low and middle income countries. The world's population is aging, there will be more older people, there will be more death. By the middle of the century, something like 500 million people each year will experience the death of a person close to them. We don't know, when making those predictions, what the effects of other unexpected epidemics or humanitarian crises of various kinds might be on those figures. I look to this issue in terms of the notion of peak oil or peak baby. When will the world reach peak dying? The point in its history when more people die than have ever done before or ever will again. We are looking at that scenario right now. Now, this has huge implications for our field. And as patterns of disease and treatment, symptoms, disability, long-term conditions change, the role of the field becomes more important and more complex. I argue that in the global north, there's an awful lot of discussion going on about how we should die. You'll have read over the last few years many best-selling books on these issues and a lot of public debate. But globally, the level of debate is incommensurate with the scale of the challenge that we face. There is an enormous challenge facing us as a global society. How will death and dying on this scale and complexity be supported globally? And I put the question, what place for the hospices in that world? I think there is a place, but some hard thinking needs to be done about it. So to conclude with just one little point, I was working closely with the Scottish Government last year on the production of the Strategic Framework for Action for palliative and end-of-life care. And I was very struck in all the discussions that took place and in looking at the document when it was produced that hospices didn't figure very strongly in a lot of the discourse. I was very pleased that the charity produced its document on hospices in Scotland recently and launched it at the Scottish Parliament. But within the strategy and within the wider discourse, it's kind of as if hospice is the elephant in the room sometimes. But I know, and you know, that one of the features of hospice is attention to detail. And when I was coming here this morning, I came through Wigan, and you probably know or saw in the papers a few months back the photograph of the lady who was dying in the hospital in Wigan and wanted to see her horse for the last time. And they brought the horse into the car park and took her out to have one last pat of its nose and to say goodbye to it. Wonderfully touching photograph. I found, though, that at the Highland Hospice, some decades before that, the elephant in the room and the true attention to hospice detail had been realised already. The patient was told that the circus was in town. She said, "I always loved the circus and I love hospices." So what did the hospice do? It brought the hospice, the elephant to the hospice. I close on that note because I've been talking about the 7 ages, the challenges, the complexity. I think it's always important to be reminded in all of this work that the unique and individual intervention, however formulated, that can make a difference to a person in their suffering and at the end of life is something that is always within our grasp if we have the imagination and the will to reach for it. Thank you very much.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed. It's often been said that you can't know where you're going to unless you know where you're coming from. And David has given us a most illuminating account of where we've come from, and I can't think of a better way of starting our conference. So we are deeply indebted to you. Thank you very much indeed. And those of you who wish to purchase a discounted copy of David's book, he's going to be around to sign them for you now as we close this session. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.